I know it's been a very long day, and I can rest assured that the people that are still here are at least very interested in the research, or else we'll do almost anything for a free drink. But I'm not sure which. But I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm lost some slides already. All right. I'm not really going to talk much about my project. What we know is that Aboriginal people in Central Australia are highly mobile, and this creates lots of problems for delivering services, for education, for employment. And what I want to do is unpack this prism through which we see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility as being problematic, and ask, well, is there a better way to think about mobility, a way that's better for policy and for delivering services? So it's a little bit of a thought journey. If you'll bear with me, just got 10 more minutes or so to go. Hopefully it'll all come together at the end. So well, I'll start by looking at some of the ways other people and other disciplines have thought about mobility. Okay, in economics, we've got the Harris-Tadaro model, and this is very much about economists think that people move to maximise our utility. To economists, that means maximise our income. So when we look at where people move, and particularly in the early days of industrialisation, there was this mystery as to why you got such big pools of unemployment in the city. Why do people keep coming to the city when there's so much unemployment? The answer is because the wages are much higher. And it's not actual incomes that you maximise, it's your expected income. So even if there's high unemployment in the urban areas, people still move there if there's a chance of getting a high-paying job. Okay, so it's not actual incomes or unemployment that should equalise, it's expected income across regions. So these were very powerful in explaining rural to urban migration during stages of industrialisation. Gravity models, basically you think about locations or places as planets out in space, where the bigger they are, the stronger the attraction, and the closer they are, the stronger the attraction. This is the idea of gravity models, except you don't have to think about the distance in terms of kilometres or space. It can be a distance in terms of cultural differences or language differences. So these models, for example, are used in explaining trade flows. We find that international trade, much more trade if the countries are big, the economies are big, if they're close together, if they have common languages, similar per capita incomes. Okay? And finally, something that came out of the previous Desert Knowledge CRC work, and specifically a model for arid Australia or remote Australia, McAllister looked at this model, basically what flora and fauna, it looks at the amazing different ways flora and fauna try to access resources when resources are scarce and variable. So these amazing strategies that, aquatic animals that can lie dormant for 10 years until, it rains again, there's a good rain again, plants and things like that. And one of the ones they point out is nomadism, which is people moving into areas where there's plentiful resources and back out again when this changes. So that's some of the previous sort of models of mobility, way people think about mobility. What do we know about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility? Well, one thing we know is that from the very first engagement with white settlers, it was seen as problematic, this sort of random, unproductive, going walkabout thing. And in actual fact, many of the policies that followed had the specific aim to try and stamp this out, to sedentarise the population. We had permit systems, we had forced removal from land, resettlements, missionaries and so on, specifically to stop people moving around, Aboriginal people. And even to this day, we still see, you still commonly hear how mobility is this sort of, problem as far as, the closing the gap agenda and the delivery of services and so on. And because of that, we really have to understand existing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility in that context, that a lot of the mobility that now happens is actually a legacy of past problems. Because of the displacement from kin, from land, a lot of the movement that now happens is people coming back to re-engage or reconnect with where they've been moved or displaced. So you've got to understand current contemporary mobility is largely a legacy, not just of current and evolving aspirations, but these past policies. So Morphy, in fact, specifically looking at a model for Indigenous mobility, said if you really want to understand the way Aboriginal people move around, you've got to understand the sacred geography, the places that are important to them, the nodal individuals and the networks, the family and kinship networks around those people. And once you understand then you'll understand patterns of mobility. So this much we do know about mobility, but there's really not much more. in all the representative studies, they're almost all based on the census, and we know the census isn't good for counting Aboriginal people, for measuring mobility. The constructs are often culturally inappropriate, which I'll talk a bit more about later. There's case study evidence, but this can't be generalised, and a lot of it's now extremely dated. And I've just included a quote there from John Taylor, who basically points out that policymakers and service providers operating who are interested in the implications of mobility are basically operating in a vacuum, an information vacuum. If there's one key lesson from the literature, which I'd like to point out, is the remarkable resilience of these traditional drivers of mobility. These traditional drivers of kinship, culture and country, they've survived even despite hundreds of years of attempts to stamp them out. They still prevail. Place and community and place still prevail, and still a very high proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders recognise our homeland and regularly visit a homeland. So there's no reason to expect these things are going to change any time in the near future. And the inescapable conclusion from this is that these things must be extremely valuable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So now I come to, is there a better way to think about mobility? And I'm going to propose just a very simple model or framework, and that is that mobility is simply a means of accessing the things that promote well-being. Okay? Includes physical goods, services, relationships. People move to access the things that promote their well-being. Very simple framework, but when you think about it, it encapsulates all those other models. It's probably most closely aligned to the economist models of maximising utility, but the economists fall down because they only worry about things if you can measure them in market prices, and they're not always the most important. You can use a gravity model and capture it with a gravity model. It incorporates McAllister's view of people moving around to access resources when they're scarce. It incorporates Murphy's model of people moving to access these things that promote their well-being, kinship networks and so on. You could even extend it to things like the very large medical literature about how mobility actually falls off, how well-being falls off when you have immobility, people with handicaps, people who are in prison. As people age, we know well-being drops off. So it's basically a sort of unifying theory or approach to how you can think about mobility, and one that I think makes more sense, and most importantly because it aligns directly with what the objective of policy should be. The objective of policy ultimately should be to maximise well-being. And that's not always immediately apparent from the things government do, but that ideally is what the objective of policy should be. So you think about this, obviously you can elaborate on this quite a bit. To get this published, I'd have to have it in a fancy diagram with arrows and boxes and, arrows coming from clever words like socio-cultural background and things like that. Clearly, there's different frameworks you could use for well-being, maybe Amartya Sen's capabilities approach. There's a number of different frameworks that you could use. And you have to recognise that there's competing means. Mobility isn't the only means for accessing these things. You can sit at home with your TV on, you can have your relationships through Facebook, use your mobile phone to order pizza. You don't need to be mobile. In fact, you probably don't even need to leave the couch to access all these things if you're happy to do it that way. So there's competing ways, and these will change with social change and with technology. So if we think about mobility as a means to access the things that promote well-being, why is it going to be different for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We know the things about Aboriginal culture. We're talking we as a white fella. Centrality of family and the extended kinship system is very important. It's not just the connections, but it's the quality of those relationships and the reciprocity that's important. But most of all, the role of connections to the land in self-identity and to well-being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is pivotal. There's so many things in culture, homelands, country, songlines, etc. that relate to physical attachment, connection to the land. So it follows directly. You can't get these things from sitting on the couch over Facebook or with a phone or getting them delivered. They're things, because wellbeing is constructed differently, we would expect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be more mobile, particularly this important attachment to the land. So these are perfectly legitimate differences in values and preferences that we would expect would lead to an increase in mobility or higher mobility for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So if you're going to accept all that, then we come to the question, well, if mobility is a way of accessing things that bring you well-being, in what possible sense is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility problematic? And I think it's because of the way we view things, or it comes from the way we view things. First, I want to notice Aboriginal people aren't actually more mobile, okay? It's a particular type of mobility, okay? Aboriginal people are less likely to move interstate if you look between the census. If you look at who's in remote towns in one census and not the next, it's the white people that move out of white towns. So it's not that they're more mobility, it's a particular type of mobility, and that's temporary mobility. Movements on, daily, weekly, maybe a couple of months trips that don't necessarily involve a change of where you reside or places that you use for accommodation. So it's temporary. The problem seems to be with temporary mobility. In James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, in the opening chapter, he invites us to think about a native forest. And he describes all the things going in that rich ecosystem, the trees, the birds that live there, the plants, the animals, all the insects, a rich diversity of an ecosystem. And then he described the advent of scientific forestry and the fact that government started taxing land where people had land holdings with forests on them, started taxing them according to how much timber could be harvested from those areas. And once they started seeing the forest in these terms, then the concepts changed, the views changed, the language changed. Everything that wasn't a tree became a weed. Everything that lived off the trees became pests. And he goes on to document lots of things in life that have come about by the state's need to measure, regulate, count and tax people. Things like urban planning. A lot of urban planning arose because of these needs. Languages, what languages were allowed to be used, what languages people were taught in. Map boundaries, even surnames. Surnames came about because of the need for governments to monitor, regulate and tax people. And when you think about so many of these constructs that we equally, because of the way we see them, we view things, and particularly about mobility to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. In the census, usual residence. Place of usual residence is the main way we measure population within the census, is not necessarily a useful construct for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who often have access to a number of residences that they regularly use and visit and stay overnight. Visitor. If it's not your place of usual residence, you're a visitor. That doesn't necessarily make sense. Nuclear families. Employment. When the Aboriginal Employment Development Policy was first introduced to Parliament in 1984, I think it was, there was a suggestion, which I thought was a great one, to extend the definition, the Australian Bureau of Statistics definition to employment, to include traditional activities like hunting and gathering. I never saw any more. I don't know what happened to that suggestion. But, we don't consider those things as employment. If we consider academics like me and our politicians as employed, surely we could consider elders to be employed. Open spaces, the use of open spaces by Aboriginal people, we see as sort of some civil disobedience and vagrancy. Even the way maps, the main unit used in the census is local government areas. You get a lot of mobility between local government areas if you look at movements between the census. If instead we define those boundaries in terms of cultural groups or language groups, about 50% of mobility would disappear straight away. It's where we draw the lines on the map which creates the mobility. So there's so many ways that we look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander with this sort of view of a state of needing to count and monitor. And I did include a quote here from Paul Memmott, who's a great researcher at University of Queensland, that temporary mobility has come to be seen as this aspect of Aboriginal culture that promotes promotes disadvantage or causes disadvantage. And as has been noted elsewhere, once you start seeing cultural differences as a cause of disadvantage, then you have these hidden forces sort of by stealth creep in for assimilation into policy and practice and service delivery. So I'd argue this is not how we should see mobility. The way we should see mobility is not as a problem, something to be overcome, but simply as a means that Aboriginal people use to access things that they value and that they value highly, things that they have cause to value and things that they have right to value in the terms of Amartya Sen's framework. So just on that note, I'll just very quickly say what we're doing in the project. The project is all about collecting data. I talked before about the information vacuum. The project is about collecting data about where people in remote Australia move, how they move, where they go, why they go, any problems, where they'd like to go but can't, barriers to mobility. And these are a map of the communities in Central Australia, mainly ones that use Alice Springs as a service centre. We're hoping to, with the community researchers, survey about 20 and 25 and collect some of the data. Here's just these are from pilots, so I don't want to hold too much in them, but the sort of data we're collecting. Services, what services do you travel away for? The main one is shopping, banking, health and so on. So we're asking why people go, what services particularly. Main reason for overnight trips. Shopping again, we see the importance of kinship networks again, visiting family and friends. Cultural activities a bit lower. Football, of course, is very important. And if you actually sort of some of the preliminary numbers, it suggests that people these Aboriginal people in remote Australia are taking trips about roughly every 2 weeks, an overnight trip. So it's confirming a very high degree of mobility. And the whole purpose of collecting this data is to inform policy, to inform planning, infrastructure provision, service providers, to say, well, you know, is there a way that we can deliver services better, but to deliver them in a way that's consistent with Aboriginal values and aspirations and not one that sees mobility as a problem? So I haven't even had my time warning. Thank you very much for listening.